Good afternoon. My name's Dave. I'm from Boston, as you can tell from my accent. This is the original Boston accent, I like to say. It's not over yet. I mean, there's some mucking about in America so badly at the moment, I think we're going to take them back. But, or maybe not, maybe we don't want them, I don't know. So I'm the product owner at Scrum.org, and can you imagine what it's like? My stakeholders are Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland. Yeah, not opinionated, not either of those. So it's a kind of an exciting roller coaster of a job, and hopefully I'll share some of those insights over the next hour or next 50 minutes. So if you need to talk to me, tweet me, email me, all that kind of stuff, feel free to do that. So what am I going to talk about? It's been a great event, hasn't it? I've actually been really impressed, I came to New Zealand. It's like Australia, but people are nice and smarter. No, don't quote me on that. I'm actually going to Australia. I hope they let me in now. I'm sure there's somebody going to be following me. But the presentations have been pretty damn impressive. And it's just awful then being the closing keynote. You're like, damn, that bar's really, really high. So I'm going to bring it down. No, I'm going to change it a little bit. I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to talk a lot about Scrum. Now, just to quote Mark Twain, the demise of Scrum, or the death of Scrum, is actually has been exaggerated, let's be honest. Scrum is still alive and hasn't died. So I'm going to talk a lot about Scrum. But I'm going to talk about the past. Now, why do we talk about the past? That's rubbish. That's over. That's yesterday's news. That's like an ex-girlfriend. It's like you never mention them, particularly to your wife. The reason why I'm going to talk about that is to remind people of what Scrum really is, to provide you with an idea of really what the essence of Scrum is, and to remind them where it came from. Because I think that's important. I think that's important because it sets the sort of the scene for the future of Scrum. We'll talk a little bit about the current situation. I'll share some insights. We have well over 1 million people doing open assessments and going to our website, and we've got a very active community, and I'll share some of those insights with you, which is kind of interesting. And I'll talk a little bit about the future that really is your responsibility, the future that you can take on board and drive. And hopefully some of those things might be useful for the jobs that you do, the missions that you're carrying out, the opportunities that you're engaged in. And hopefully we'll have some fun and everybody will stay awake during the keynote. So that's one of my missions. That's how I measure success. So let's set some context, the scene, really, and just remind people the impact that somebody that I report to has had and the journey that we've got to Scrum.org. So in the 90s, the 80s actually, the end of the 80s, the 90s, Ken and Jeff were working on a number of projects. And they found them very, very frustrating. And they read a number of pieces, one of which being the new product game, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail later, which drove them to think about a different way of building software, which was manifest in the Agile Manifesto. Hey, claim to fame. So I was the RUP product manager. I know, boo-boo, hiss, whatever. I'm in therapy. I'm getting over it. But we were invited by actually Alistair Coburn to go to Snowbird, to the meeting. And Grady was invited, I wasn't invited. Grady Booch sent me an email saying, Dave, should I go? I said, what, those rad guys? No, it's a waste of time. Yeah, that was a good decision by us at RUP, wasn't it? So anyway, the Agile Manifesto was, so never say no is something you can learn about. The Agile Manifesto was written, driven, Ken and Jeff were there. Then Ken formed the Agile Alliance, worked with the Agile Alliance for a number of years, then found that wasn't really allowing innovation ideas, formed Scrum Alliance, found that they were focused on a more broad mission, and brought that back, and then formed Scrum.org. Scrum.org is the home of Scrum. Interesting point, though. The mission of Scrum.org and the mission of Jeff and Ken is not about Scrum. So if anybody's a Scrum religious person, do you know the difference between a terrorist and a methodologist? You can reason with a terrorist. That doesn't go over well in some. I tried to do it in the Middle East. It was really a bad joke. I was like, okay, Oops. Anyway, but the point is, there's a lot of people that think that Scrum is a be-all and end-all. There's a lot of people that think that Scrum is everything, and that's everything. Even we don't at scrum.org. We actually think that Scrum is a fantastic tool for helping you approach teams and situations and problems and products in a different way. Our mission isn't about Scrum, and it shouldn't be for you. It should be about how do I improve my profession? How do I get better at the craft of delivering software? How do I wow my customers? How do I get better at what I do? And that really is our mission as well, which is interesting. So some interesting data points here. 90% of agile teams are doing Scrum. That loosely translates to somewhere between 12 and 15 million people every day doing a daily Scrum. Badly. By the way, it's not a daily stand-up because that's a little divisive if you can't stand up or you're tired or you've done your back or when you've got to my age. Between 12 and 15 million people. Practiced all over the world. That's incredible numbers. Over 1 million people have done our open assessments. Almost 100,000 people have done professional Scrum Master, professional Scrum Product Owner. We've got 170 professional Scrum trainers in the world, 70,000 people taught everywhere throughout the world. But there's only one Scrum guide. Hopefully you picked it up from the booth or from the area, and not really booths, are they? They're sort of areas, and had an opportunity to look at it. How many people have read the Scrum Guide? You're awesome. You see? You're brilliant. Also, New Zealand, it's great. Apart from your rugby, which we'll talk about in a minute. So, one Scrum Guide. Isn't that incredible? And actually, Scrum forms the basis of pretty much the majority of other agile approaches, whether it be DAD, whether it be less, whether it be safe. It forms the basis of the majority of approaches, whether they be in-house or commercial, around delivering agile to the enterprise. So Scrum is still very relevant. I'll talk more about it. Now, there was a point that was made earlier today that I just want to make sure that we get sorted out. Scrum is not about training wheels on a bike. Scrum is the bike. And the reason why I say that is that Scrum isn't a framework that just keeps you safe and actually doesn't let you learn to be agile. What it does is actually it exposes the fact that you're going to fall off over and over and over and over again. It does that by 3 pillars: inspection and adaptation based on transparency. It does that by continuously making things observable to the team. So I would argue that Scrum is all about doing that right. And hopefully I'm going to share some of those insights during the next presentation to the next slides. So let's talk about where it came from and why it isn't about bikes and training wheels and the like. So that's a great Danish philosopher. Didn't know they had any philosophers in Denmark, but apparently they do. And he said something that's pretty cool, that you can only really change the future, but ultimately looking at the past is incredibly useful to understand that future. And so I'll try to do that. So I'm going to take you back in time. Some of you, this is before you were born. But no, take you back in time. 21 years, 95, right? Can only be remembered 1995? Great. You can. Obviously, apparently. You're obviously very young, sir. Mariah Carey was top of the charts, not in New Zealand. No idea what was top in charts in New Zealand, probably the Birdie song or something. But the 1995, Mariah Carey, Bill Clinton, the only president to be called Clinton, was the president of the United States of America. I don't know, there's some chap there, I'm not quite sure who he is. Apparently he was your prime minister at that point. Don't even know. And then Windows 95 had just come on. Interesting story about New Zealand. The first time I was in New Zealand was in 1997. And I remember because your government collapsed. There was an issue, it collapsed, proportional representation, the 2 parties fell out, or the 3 parties, or the 8 parties, or whatever it works. They fell out, and the government collapsed. It was on page 7 because you'd lost a test match against Australia. Other news. Yeah, the government's collapsed. But back to those All Blacks. What do you think? I think that's That shows you focus, doesn't it, really? Windows 95 had just come out in 95. Actually, it came out a little bit before that, but there was a few bugs, so they, brought it out again. And that was the cell phone of choice, that Nokia. It's amazing how the world has changed since those times. That's when Scrum was created. Interestingly, it was created because of this. Has anybody read this book? This is Fred Brooks' book, The Mythical Man Month. There's No Silver Bullet is another great piece. What he exposed was the fact that if you've got 10 developers and it takes you a month to build a piece of software, if you had 20 developers, how long is it going to take? Probably 2 months. That software does not obey the laws of physics. To quote Scotty from the Star Trek, which is a very important person to quote, it doesn't. It's mad. It's crazy. It's non-linear. It's not like other manufacturing processes or processes in general. And that really annoyed Jeff and Ken. So much they started doing a lot of research, and they found this particular piece. This is a piece you should look at. It's a new product game. I recommend everybody reads it a couple of times. It's really useful. And it highlighted these 6 things that highly innovative organizations were doing. Now, innovative organizations in 1985 were 3M, Honda. Companies are like, bloody hell, are they still around? Yeah, they are, and they're very, very successful. It talked about how they did product innovation. And there was a few interesting things. Maybe we can start seeing this in a lot of the things that have been talked about today. Built-in instability. So these organizations had teams that were focused on innovation that by their very nature weren't siloed into particular roles or responsibilities. They were very fluid, very dynamic. They self-organized. They were autonomous. They could decide how they worked together. They overlapped things into something called iterations. They learned by doing. Dare I call that empirical? And we'll talk more about that in a minute. They had very minor process controls. They were governed by outcomes, not by activities. And they were all about learning what works, learning what made sense to their customers, learning about what was feasible, because this is 1985, manufacturing was tricky, working out what was feasible. These principles defined how Scrum was put together, and it formed the basis of a lot of the understanding around that. And really, we've all seen this Denning chart. We've all seen this chart here. But ultimately, it was about trying to deal with the unknown. That's very relevant for today, right? We live in a world of unknowns. We live in a world of surprises, which is very worrying for everybody. And ultimately, we need a process, an approach that allows us to navigate that. If we knew everything, there's no way we would do something as inefficient as agile software delivery. We would organize by specialization of roles. We would have resources. We would do all the things that Waterfall and many PMOs still want to do today. But ultimately, we don't know what our customers want. We don't know what the software can do for us. We don't know how this team is going to work together. We can't predict all of those things because it's non-linear, because it's complex and complicated. So that led Ken and Jeff to think a bit about empiricism. It led them to think that Waterfall, the approach coined by Winston Royce, which is a very hard name to say when you've been drinking, Winston Royce defined the idea of Waterfall, and it was really in response to how you manage software delivery. And Ken and Jeff and others at that time were like, no, we need to move to an empirical approach. The idea of experimentation, the idea of hypothesis. That concept of hypothesis was at the heart of Scrum and still continues to drive it. We deliver working software to prove a sprint goal, which ultimately is a series of hypotheses or one major hypothesis that we're trying to realize. So that basically means that we need to move to a very different approach. We need to understand a problem, do some definition of it, decide on a solution, build some software, measure the success, and iterate till happy. Small batch size is the only way to feasibly do that because we know that we're probably going to get it wrong, and we need to learn whilst doing that. But that means, and we're going to come back to this in a lot more detail later, that means that actually we're optimizing not for efficiency. We're optimizing for learning and innovation and value, because ultimately we're innovating to deliver value. So we're not managing resources, so they're max. I don't care if the team isn't working 5,000 hours a day. I don't care about any of those things. I care about the outcomes. I care about the results, and I care about the learning. They talk about failing fast, but Scrum isn't about failure, because if you've learned something, you've not failed. So we're organized for that. And that's all described in something called the Scrum Guide. And the Scrum Guide is readily available. It's in 46 languages, and it's available for everybody at scrumguide.net. We maintain it for everybody. And ultimately, at the heart of it is this Scrum framework. Now, I've got a bit of a problem with this framework. And we're currently going through a negotiation, I like to call it, with Jeff and Ken about this diagram. Because this implies something, doesn't it? It implies, some people read this as a mini waterfall. It implies that this sprint review is a phase gate to releasing software, right? It's not. A sprint review is about inspection and adaptation at the product level with the right people, so SMEs, etc., to review the product. It is not about releasing it to production. Ultimately, it's about getting feedback on it. Now, ideally, a great sprint review is on production software. A great sprint review is on software that's currently in use, with maybe some lean analytics that are telling us how people are using it. Ideally, a sprint review is about customer usage. And the people that you've got in the room are people from marketing and that, or whoever's involved, that are trying to understand how people are using this software and what it means so that we can inspect and adapt and improve that process in the next sprint. So maybe we'll change this diagram at some point, but changing things is not necessarily always easy, for good reason. We try to keep Scrum relatively stable so that people, the 12 to 15 million people in the world using it, don't think, oh my God, we need version 4, or version 5, or version 6, or whatever. So there's some implications of doing Scrum. And I think we all know these implications. Learning is business value. That's kind of hard to sort of step up to. Speed is vital for learning, because we need to get it fast, get that learning back into our system. Failure is a natural part of learning. That means the team must be empowered to both fail in terms of getting things wrong so we learn by it. The business needs to be part of the solution to make them part of this ultimate result. And that means that we need to have teams that are cross-functional. And we'll talk more about DevOps in a little while. But we need all the skills necessary to get that learning. We need all the skills necessary to deliver that. And that means we can't be prescriptive, because we don't know enough to define a process ultimately that allows us to do that. And the 3 pillars are key. So Scrum, it was invented as a response to this desire to deliver a very different way of understanding the problem, the non-linear nature of software delivery. So how's it going? What's happening with Scrum? Let's have a little look. Scrum is incredibly popular today. And I think in part of it is because software is incredibly popular. Now, I believe that software is the most important commodity in our world. I believe that it can save people's lives. I believe it will feed people in Africa or India or Asia. I believe that it will put a man and woman on Mars and hopefully bring them back. I believe that it will change everything. I don't know if any of us had the opportunity to be in a Tesla. And both Ken and Jeff have got Teslas. And the self-drive is incredible. It really is. It means you actually trust Ken driving now, which is really a big step forward. It's changing the world. It's keeping me alive when I'm sitting with him, which is great. And so because of that, in response, what we're seeing is agility is growing. Now, obviously, you're at an Agile conference, so you know this. But isn't it ever so interesting that we're seeing now the majority of organizations are doing Agile? It's gone mainstream. And Scrum is the de facto standard, which puts a big target on the back. So I would ask you, though, to help Scrum get better rather than spend your whole life inventing a process that competes with it. Hopefully, we're going to have a community in place that allows us to do that. So Scrum has been the standard. And the results are starting to look quite promising. So Jeff and I talked about this yesterday. This is the Standish Chaos Report, which some people don't like, and I respect that. But it's interesting. It's about 100,000 projects. Now, you might say, what about products, and what about ISVs, and et cetera? So it's just some data. You can take it for what it's worth. But the thing that's really nice about this, look at that data. Agile is more successful than waterfall. Proven. Data supports it. Well, that's not a surprise for us. But even for large projects, it's more successful. It also highlights the fact you shouldn't do large things because they're incredibly difficult, which is probably sensible. So the reality today is that we are being successful. Agile has, and Scrum has, improved software delivery to our industry, which is great, but it still fails sometimes. And it's interesting as to know why it does. Remember what we talked about agility being around learning and innovation and customer value? Really important ideas, right? Organizations ultimately have been organized around something very different. Now, maybe your organizations aren't organized in this way, but the majority of organizations that I see today are built around risk mitigation, not risk from a company point of view, personal risk mitigation. So there's committees and meetings and sign-offs, and nobody totally is responsible for anything, but they're all involved in everything. And they're built around efficiency and maximizing efficiency. So you have organizations on top of organizations, the PMO, making sure that we get the maximum resources on a project. Developers are sliced into multiple slices. You always get the foot if you're unlucky, if you're last to the meeting. I wanted the brain. No, you got the foot, unfortunately. And so what we've found is that these organizations are optimized for very different things. And that basically means that there's a friction. Now, when I was an analyst, I was presenting some data around agile adoption. This was about 6 years ago. No, gosh, my God, doesn't time fly, eh? It was about 8 years ago. And I was, pontificating in my usual sort of rambunctious way. And there was a gentleman in the front, and I said, well, 30% of all projects are now agile. And he goes, excuse me. I was like, yes. He goes, excuse me, how do you know? I said, well, we interviewed a series of organizations, and it's statistically significant. It's about 1,200 organizations. I did the analyst thing. So I just, made up stuff and used numbers. And he said, but did they actually really know that for sure? Did you just ask them if they're agile? And he was kind of right. He was probably a tester. So testers are awesome. If you're a tester, you're awesome. You just won't be invited to any parties that I have. Anyway, this gentleman was right. I was like, damn it. I don't actually know. So we did a serious undertaking. We not only interviewed these organizations, we really delved deep. We did about 400 or 500 people that we talked to. I didn't. I just sat around. But there was a bunch of people that did. And we identified that, yes, a lot of organizations were doing Scrum. It was great. But we only plan once a year, and we have this huge planning process that's about 3 months long. But we're doing Scrum. You are? Okay, yeah. And we're doing Scrum, but we only release once a year. The customers don't want it more, do they? I mean, God, it wrecks everything. They hate releasing software. They hate new versions. So I called this Water Scrum Full. Maybe this resonates in your organization. Maybe you see that Scrum is living in an organization that is predominantly waterfall in nature. Maybe you see this in your organization. And that is the reality that we see. In fact, this is from Ken. What we've seen is enterprise agility has been largely disappointing. It's kind of a little bit disappointing, or a large bit disappointing. And the reason why that is when Scrum was invented and when the ideas of agility were invented, XP, etc., they assumed that they would just work inside teams, and then a bit like bird flu or mono, if you're a teenager, glandular fever, whatever we call it, they'd slowly translate and grow. You'd basically, people would leave teams, they'd go, oh, this is the best way of building. Oh, they would then talk to, you'd over drinks, you'd talk to somebody, and it would just grow. It never really did, because there's a huge group of people whose sole job is to keep the status quo, an amorphous blob of middle management. And that kind of stopped it. They're ultimately incentivized over a whole different set of things. The other thing that we see is this model where you paste an approach over the top of your existing organization and call it agile. I wouldn't be as bold to say that SAFe does that, but sometimes people implement SAFe in that way, or DAD, or some other mechanisms. It really is the same old stuff with a different label. And incremental change, using something like Cutter or something like that, what we've seen over and over again is incremental agile adoptions kind of grind to a halt when the CIO changes every 18 months, tends to be, or 2 years, or when budgets dry up, and it slowly grinds to a halt. So we see that in many organizations, which is very disappointing. The other thing is we've got some interesting data from the assessments. Scrum Masters, 10 times more popular than any other assessment or anything that we have. Everybody wants to be a master. Who wouldn't? I've seen Kung Fu. It's a fabulous show, which is interesting. But you wonder how many Scrum developers there are in the world, but Scrum Master seems to be the most interesting thing. A lot of people are doing the mechanics of Scrum. They're riding their bike with the training wheels on, but they've kind of forgotten why they're doing it. They've forgotten about inspection and adaptation. They've forgotten about the values. They've forgotten about the integrity, the Agile Manifesto. They're just doing Scrum. They're doing the dance, but they've really not got the rhythm, like any Brit dancing. They're self-directing. So self-organization is still a mystery to most organizations. It really is. You tell people how they're going to be organized and then hope that they survive that. They still want to have lots of specialization. People feel more comfortable in that sort of place. Product ownership is universally broken. Now, whether it's 2 roles, 1 role, 5 roles, whether it's the team, I don't know. I have a personal, very strong opinion that it has to be a single human being, a bit like the earlier keynote. But a lot of people treat it as business analysis, which is kind of weird because it really isn't. Business analysis is a Scrum team role. Product ownership is a business role to make decisions about what the priorities are around the product. Now, how they do that is to work with lots of different people, but it's a leadership role. But most organizations have a real challenge getting that because Agile's coming from the IT organization, and the business wants to be sort of agile, but kind of doesn't really get it, isn't part of the transformation. And Scrum Masters are neutered in most organizations. Yeah, they're those hippie guys that sort of do these meetings where everybody stands up, but they're not empowered to make the changes necessary to allow agility to be successful. So Scrum is very popular, but it's kind of being, Martin Fowler calls it flaccid, which is a horrible word. I'm never using it again. But when Martin Fowler calls you flaccid, it's a little embarrassing. But I guess it depends location. But anyway, so Scrum is being disempowered. Agile is being disempowered in our organization. When we look at the community at the macro level, we see ultimately the business doesn't care about agile. They care about delivering innovation. They care about digital. They care about delivering business value. They care about their future competitors. Legacy gets in the way of doing it. Outsourcing and other organizational models get in the way of us actually building these teams. We see organizations having to do all sorts of things that aren't necessarily well thought through and certainly aren't optimized about learning and about an empirical process. So it ain't all great, but don't be afraid, as the Colonel says in the A-Team, we have a plan. And I believe that we can fix all of these things. But I think it's going to be painful. And hopefully some of these ideas you can take on board and start using or helping us get better in the industry. There's 4 main themes of change that we're seeing around Scrum, and I just want to share those with you. There's a theme around measurement. It's an empirical process, right, Scrum? We all get that. It's empiricism. But ultimately, most organizations have a damned hard time determining value. Jeff talked a lot about this. How do you determine hypothesis? We heard a fantastic talk from the product manager of Confluence around how you do roadmaps and how you define value in that. Ultimately, we need a better way of measuring the success of our products, a way that allows us to manage the trade-offs between technical debt, business value, the future, the immediate, and trying to get something in place that does that. So that's one area that we really need to improve. We also need to think about the values again. We talk a lot about going back to the basics of Agile. That was in the keynote this morning, but ultimately, we need to bring those values and make them real. We need to think about scaling. And I don't mean scaling in terms of how's the organization structured. Well, maybe I do. But I definitely mean scaling in terms of how you get multiple teams to work together on a consistent endeavor. And we need to think about what future organizations look like that support this model. I believe we need to hack. We don't need to transform. We need to transition to a different organization structure to allow Agile to be successful. These 4 things are the things that keep me up at night, and hopefully you are going to take some of them on board and help me make them a success. Let's talk about measurement. So how do we separate the valuable from the wasteful? How do we do that? We need to start focusing not on velocity, not on defect density, not on burn downs, burn ups, burn whatever you want to do. We need to focus instead on direct evidence. I don't care what your velocity is, but I do care about the value you're delivering. So about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, we built a series of measures that we've been trialing with a number of organizations, a lot of airline companies for some reason. Apparently airlines, it's really, software's really in. Though you wouldn't know it from their websites, would you? But anyway, so we started looking at this, and we identified 3 main areas. One area which is all around current value. So revenue per employee, product cost ratio, employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction are some examples of that. That's one very important part of the 3 sort of legged thing. The other one is time to market. How do you get stuff to market? Release frequency, how stable it is, cycle time, mean time to resolution, those kind of things. And the third really is around innovation. How many people are using the new features? How many people are actually identifying issues with them? What's the index release? You know, what people are using, what versions, etc. So how do we innovate? Those 3 dimensions support each other because ultimately, when you're delivering product, you have to think about balance. You can't just concentrate on one thing. You have to somehow manage to continuously evolve your products. And unfortunately, most businesses are very short-term in their focus, but software, it don't go away. It takes a lot of effort to kill software. I remember I just come out of university. This was a long time ago now, 92, 91. And I got my first gig, and I was working on a piece of COBOL. I know, crazy. And it said, there was this huge section that said, this piece of software, this piece of code is only relevant until January the 7th, 1982. I'm just making the date up, I can't remember. And I thought, oh, we're past that date, I'm just going to take it out. So I took it out. I then ran it, it fell over everywhere. I was like, my God, how do you... And I said to the guy that I was working with, I just took this out. He goes, oh, yeah, I don't really know what it does anymore. I just sort of leave that. It's fine. So I put it back and everything was fine. It's very hard to kill software. But ultimately, if we just concentrate on short-term issues, we'll slowly increase the debt, the technical debt of our software, and we'll end up walking through treacle or molasses. and it becomes harder and harder to deliver change. So we need to balance that with delivering new features, with quality, with risk, with all those other things. So number one thing is around measurement. Let's put in place measures that help us understand our products from a different point of view. The second thing is around values. Now, we talk a lot about agility as not just a mechanical process, but a way of thinking. And to do that and to be successful with Agile, we have to think about these 5 principles or these 5 values that are very important. I'm going to start at the bottom because I think that's probably the best place to begin now. But that's the, we'll come to commitment at the end because often people confuse that. But courage is the first one. The first thing that you have to admit, which is very different from most organizations' natural way of delivering anything or working, is you have to admit that you don't know everything. Now, as an Englishman, that goes against everything I learned from an early age. We are told that you do know everything, and we currently still own the empire, even if nobody else realizes that. You know, that's what we're told. So courage to admit you don't know everything. It's kind of hard to do. I remember I was working on the RUP, the Rational Unified Process, and I discovered during this time that having a W in my name was awesome, because it meant at the release call, which happened every week, I was last on the agenda, which is great, being West. I was always worried that somebody with like a Z or something would come in, but they didn't. So I was last. And basically, the call every week went through this stupid process where we were all waiting for somebody to say, I'm going to be late. So then we could all bundle in and be late with them. But it wasn't our fault. We were just kind of taking advantage. We weren't ever really courageous. We never admitted that we're having problems. Also, respect was very important. The level of respect that we have to, security, safety, that we need to have in our organizations needs to be very high for Agile and Scrum to work. We need to respect that the people that we have in our team can do the job. We have to trust them to do it. We have to be open about it. And we have to focus on the things that are important. The beauty of a backlog is you can always say yes, just not now. By focusing, we can deliver the most valuable things today and worry about some of the other things tomorrow. And we need to be committed. When we make strong commitments using Scrum, not in terms of what we're going to deliver, but we're committed to learning and doing our damnedest to understand what value really means to our customers. Commitment is crucial. We're not committing that I can definitely deliver all of these product backlog items in this sprint, but I'm committing that I'm going to do a good job trying, and I'm going to learn from it during this sprint. These values were added to the Scrum Guide on the 7th of July. I recommend everybody takes a picture of this or writes them down or does some other form of whatever to remember them, or just memorizes them because you're really smart, and uses them in your retrospectives. How have we demonstrated one of these? Talk a little bit about how you can exercise respect in your team. Try to focus on openness. Try to get your transparency. Really, really important. And we'll continue to add more examples and tools, practices to expose these. Okay, so we've got measurement and we've got the values. So let's talk about size. So Scrum teams work really, really well in spite of the environments around them, usually. One Scrum team with really good professionals in, using great engineering practices, succeeds. 9 times out of 10, they do very, very well. The data from the Standish report supports this. Yeah, and they're using this process, really, really good process. You know, we all do that. We could probably move the increment. We'll talk about that again. But yeah, it's working very, very well. What happens when you have multiple Scrum teams? It starts getting hard, doesn't it? It starts getting complicated, starts getting difficult. Why? Well, how do we work together? How does it all fit together? Do we have a Scrum of Scrums? Do we have a Scrum of Scrums of Scrums? Do we, who takes the lead? Who's ultimately, how many product owners do we have? Do we have 4 product owners? Do we have one for each team? How many Scrum Masters? Do the Scrum Masters meet separately on a dark night in a small room and talk about us? How does it all work? How do we get done? So about 3 years ago, when I wasn't working at Scrum.org, but I was working with Ken, I was talking to Ken, he's my sort of mentor when I was working at TaskTop. I asked him this, and he goes, "You're smart, Dave, sort it out." I thought, I think we need some guidance. And so we released, with lots of arguing, we released something called Nexus. And Nexus is an exoskeleton to Scrum. And what it does is, which is very, very straightforward, is it just answers some of those questions. How many product owners do you have? 1. If it's one product, you have 1 product owner. How many backlogs do you have? 1 product backlog, for instance. It provides an exoskeleton to Scrum. It's still Scrum, but it just adds additional events, activities, and roles to Scrum. Very simple, very lightweight, to help multiple teams work together. You can use Nexus with Safe, you can use it with DAD, you can use it with Less. There's no contradiction there. It just provides you with some mechanisms to help your teams work together in an effective way, to deliver done software. And it's really focused on removing dependencies. It's really focused on highlighting those dependencies earlier and resolving them quicker. And I'm not going to bore you with Nexus descriptions, but you might want to look at it. It's available for everybody. Just download the guide and start using it. And the reason why I think Nexus is valuable is it provides us with the foundation to help us effectively get, for all of these scaling approaches, Scrum to be more effective at scale. And as you can see there from our friends at version 1, what they're saying is that ultimately Scrum continues to be the most used scaling approach, which is pretty cool. So, measurement, values, Nexus. These are some of the things we're working on today to help us solve some of those challenges that we have around Scrum and around enterprise agility and around Agile in those organizations. But it's still problematic inside most companies. I believe it's time for us to actually just accept that and say that transitioning Scrum into an existing organization is possible, but it's blimmin' hard. It's like going up a hill backwards with only one leg. That's a weird analogy, but you know what I mean. Yeah, I have no idea how you would do that, but maybe. So I think it's time for a new approach. Now, we've been talking to a lot of organizations and looking at their digital innovation centers and trying to identify a pattern, dare I say, framework for how these organizations are organized. Most of them are doing some form of agile approach. Most of them are doing actually Scrum. So what are some of the things that they've put in place that allow very flat organizations to be successful? Because majority of these innovation centers are networked. They're not hierarchical. They're very flat, maybe one or two levels maximum. They tend to focus on outcomes or value. They tend to deliver very, very frequently. They tend to use cutting-edge approaches to building software, and the majority, not all, but the majority use some form of Scrum, maybe with a little bit of Kanban thrown in for good measure. And they're very different. So what are some of the characteristics? So ultimately, their agility is natural for them. Leadership and the structure around that. It's not in spite, we're just going to let those agile guys do it, and we'll just build things around them. They're just connected. They talk in terms of products, not in terms of projects. That's a very interesting challenge for most organizations. And when they talk about products, one thing I've noticed is that the products tend to be all around outcomes, customer outcomes, not about feature functions or even apps. In fact, they tend to span multiple apps because the legacy systems are built in a different way and are structured in a different way. It includes operations, dare I say DevOps. Most of these innovation centers include some level of support third line, usually, not one or two, but it's interesting that operations is a natural part of it. Now, that might be shadow IT, 9 times out of 10. They're using things like AWS. They're basically pushing their own stuff to market. They're not dependent on existing IT organizations or infrastructure, but it doesn't have to. It could be a different model. Everybody's necessary for releasing working product to customers is actually in this organization. And only things that are relevant to that organization and to that model of way of working are actually part of it. And there's a sort of onboarding that brings them in. They have measurements that are very lean, very agile and value-based, externally focused. And the teams are persistent and tribal in a sort of Spotify kind of model. They support each other. They don't disappear. They're only on one team. Those sort of things that sound really simple, but most organizations seem to have a hard time doing. And they use a consistent practice-driven approach for releasing software. So they take advantage of automation, and they have a consistent model of doing that. Interesting, 9 times out of 10 documented in Confluence for some reason, which is sort of bizarre, but it's true. Consistent set of tools that support it, and proven, and which is interesting, and professional, meaning that they care about each other, they actually care about their craft, they are continuously pushing things forward. This kind of organization is the organization that I would like to work in. I don't know about you. It's an organization that's built around Scrum and around Agile. Agile's a first-class citizen in this organization. It's a hack, I agree, because it doesn't deal with any of the existing, dare I say, crap that you're dealing with. In fact, what it does is create a separate organization to deal with it. And that means, though, that we're changing our mission at scrum.org. It means that it's not about development anymore. It's about delivery. It's about actually getting software into customers' hands and getting that feedback into the process. It means that we have to build bridges to the DevOps community to make that a reality. And that means that we ultimately have to build organizations that accept that customers are going to use some software and feed that back into the life cycle. That increment is actually being used by customers. And that's what we're very much focused on. So, Scrum's 21 years old. In America, that means it can drink. In New Zealand, it's been drinking for 3 years and making a bit of a mess, probably. It's been incredibly successful. Between 12 and 15 million people are using it every day. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. All started in a small room in Burlington, Massachusetts. What we're seeing, though, is that the power of Scrum is still being neutered by organizations. It's not quite as successful as it could be. Water Scrum 4 is the reality that we see. And to change that, we have to do a few things. What we have to do is we have to think more about measurement. Think about measuring the value that we're delivering each sprint in a different way. We need to think about the values so we can bring those back into our teams to make our teams more effective, to make our teams more empowered. We need to think about scaling in a different way and allow these teams to integrate in a better way so we don't have those challenges around dependency. And ultimately, I think we need to hack organizations and build separate organizations to be effective around allowing Scrum to really deliver on the opportunity. And if we do that, Scrum's going to be relevant for a long time in the future. It might not be called Scrum, it might be called something else. I don't really care. But ultimately, if we can get that empiricism and empower the people and get out of the way of them, we can change the world. In fact, not we can, you can. I mean, obviously the bottom part of the world, the top part's a long way away. It's a hell of a long way away, but well, yeah, yes, I think you're completely wrong there, but good. Depends on your point of view, I guess, right? But ultimately, you can change the world if we start thinking about those things. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Hopefully that was a little interesting. Hopefully you thought a little bit back to really why we're doing Scrum. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little roller coaster conversation. Well, thank you.